Winter came early to the forests of Dalarna in 1923. 11 men arrived at a remote timber camp 8 miles north of a river crossing that most maps didn't bother to name. They were there to fell timber. They were there because they needed the work. What came for them in the long, dark weeks that followed was something that none of them had a name for in any language they trusted. I am 71 years old as I write this, and my hands have not been entirely steady since the winter of my 24th year. I was the youngest man in that camp by 4 years, hired on as a general hand and swamper by the Great Northern Timber Consortium, a company that, as best I can tell, no longer exists under any name. They paid fair wages for that era, and they asked very few questions, which suited 11 men in a province where honest employment had grown as scarce as warm weather. I arrived on the 3rd day of November with blisters already forming on my heels and the smell of pine resin so thick in the air it coated the back of my throat. The camp itself was a reasonable one, as such places went. 3 bunkhouses built of hand-hewn logs, a cookhouse that smelled permanently of boiled salt pork and coffee grounds, and an equipment shed where the cross-cut saws and double-bit axes hung in rows like weapons in an armory. The foreman was a man named Lindqvist, 52 years old, with a jaw that looked carved from the same granite that pushed up through the forest floor every spring. He ran a quiet camp and he ran it well, and the men respected him in the way that working men respect competence over any other virtue. There were 11 of us in total. Lindqvist, who doubled as camp boss and timber cruiser. Eriksson, the cook, a rotund man of 50 with hands like shovels and a talent for turning salt pork and dried beans into something a man could eat for weeks without losing his mind. Then there was Carl, 28, lean as a stripped birch sapling, with eyes the color of ice over deep water, and a way of going quiet when other men would have spoken, that made you feel the weight of what wasn't being said. I will tell you more about Carl, because Carl matters to this account in ways that took me years to understand. Subscribe now if you haven't already. These accounts deserve to be heard, and there are more in the archives than I can set down in a single telling. The other men filled the usual roles in the usual ways. Bjorn and Halvorsen were fellers, thick-set and unhurried in the way that men become when their work requires precise force rather than speed. Old Martin, 60 if he was a day, drove the draft horse team and claimed he had worked timber camps in 3 provinces, though he spoke of them in a way that suggested he'd been glad to leave each one behind. There was Sigurd, who kept a pocket Bible and read from it each night before sleeping, and Per, who kept a journal in a small leather notebook that he carried in his breast pocket at all times. Per's journal is how I know the precise sequence of certain events, because memory is an unreliable instrument when fear has had its way with it. We fell into the camp's rhythms quickly, as men do when the work is hard and the days are short. Breakfast before full light, into the timber by first light, working through the blue Nordic dusk until our arms ached too deeply to continue. The trees fell with a sound like the earth clearing its throat, and the work filled the hours completely in the way that only physical labor can. In the evenings we ate and we mended tools, and we did not talk over much, because tired men in timber camps learn early that silence is a form of rest. The days had a completeness to them that I remember now with something close to envy. A time when the shape of each hour was known and the work demanded all of a man and left him with nothing to carry into sleep. The first thing I noticed that wasn't right came on the 6th night. It was not dramatic. That is important to say at the outset, because in the telling of such things, people expect an opening that matches the ending, some bright signal that announces itself as the beginning of something terrible. The first thing was simply a sound. I had risen to use the latrine, that cold walk through dark air that a man in a timber camp makes a dozen times a winter, and I was standing in the dark several yards from the bunkhouse when I heard it. It was low, a sound somewhere between a groan and a resonance, the way a very large instrument might sound if played in a register meant for something other than human ears. It rose and fell, and there was a quality to its rising and falling that I can only describe as structured. Not musical, not language, but not random noise. Like something that had its own grammar I had no tools to parse. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then it stopped, and the silence that replaced it felt different from the silence that had preceded it, as if something had shifted in the arrangement of the dark. I told no one. A man learns not to in camps like these, where admitting to nervousness is a tax on your standing that takes weeks to pay back. I lay in my bunk and listened, but the sound did not return, and eventually I slept. Per noted in his journal the following morning that he had heard, and I am reading now from a copy I made of his pages many years later, a low vibration in the night that he attributed to wind through the upper canopy. That was Per's way, practical and explanatory. A man who lived comfortably in the assumption that the world made sense. I did not tell him then that I had been outside, and that there had been no wind. The trees had been absolutely still. Whatever produced that sound had produced it from its own body. The second sign came 3 days later, and this one could not be attributed to wind. Old Martin found the tracks. He came in for the midday meal, looking the way men look when they've decided that what they saw probably doesn't need to be mentioned, but have concluded that it probably does. He set down his cup and he said without preamble that there were prints in the snow north of the horse pen that he did not recognize. Lindqvist asked him what kind of prints. Martin said he didn't know, which from a man who had driven timber horses through 3 provinces was not a comfortable answer. We went after the meal to look. The prints were large. Not impossibly so, not in the first moment of looking. Your mind reaches for the familiar when it encounters the unfamiliar, and my mind reached first for bear, which is the large-footed explanation that the forest offers most readily in those latitudes. But bears in November in Dalarna are in their dens, and Lindqvist knew this, and we all knew this, and the thought drifted away from bear as quickly as it had arrived. The prints were wrong in ways that accumulated as you looked at them longer, the wrongness arriving not all at once but in stages, like a face that seems familiar until you realize you are looking at something that has only borrowed its features from something you know. What the tracks showed was a bipedal stride, 2 feet, wide-spaced, sinking deep into snow that other men's boots barely compressed. The stride was long, longer than any man's stride I had ever measured. Lindqvist paced it out at roughly 5 feet between impressions, which is not a measurement that any man in that clearing found comfortable. The print itself was wide across the ball and narrow at the heel, and there were suggestions of toes. 4 of them, it appeared, though the snow had softened the edges enough to make a precise count impossible. Carl, who had said nothing during the entire inspection, reached into the nearest print and pressed his hand flat against its bottom. His hand filled perhaps a third of it. No one said anything that needed saying. We walked back to camp. We kept working. That night, Lindqvist held what passed for a meeting in that sort of setting, which was to say he sat at the cookhouse table after supper and spoke plainly to the men who remained. He said the tracks were likely an elk with an unusual gait, or possibly a moose that had been moving in an odd pattern due to injury or illness. Bjorn said he had never seen moose tracks that looked like those, and Lindqvist agreed that it was unusual but maintained that it was the only sensible explanation. Sigurd opened his Bible. Per wrote in his journal. Carl looked at the wall. The sound came back that third night, and this time it was closer. I was not alone in hearing it. Per noted in his journal that he woke at what he estimated as 2 in the morning to a low resonance that seemed to originate from the tree line north of the bunkhouses, approximately where the tracks had been found. He described it as resembling the sound that very large animals make when communicating over distances, but noted that he could not identify the species and that it carried an unsettling quality of variation, as if the sound was modulating deliberately. What Per wrote more carefully than he wrote in most entries was this. At one point in the sequence of sounds, it paused, and then, from a different direction, farther south, another sound answered it. The interval between call and response was consistent. 7 seconds, as near as he could estimate. The call from the north came again, and 7 seconds later, the answer from the south. This happened 4 times before both sounds stopped simultaneously. The entry ended there. Below it, Per had drawn a rough diagram of the camp clearing with 2 arrows, one from the north margin and one from the south, both pointing inward toward a small square he had labeled with the word bunkhouses. What was it waiting for? What were there 2 of them doing in the dark and call and response circling a camp of 11 sleeping men? I have had nearly 50 years to think about this question, and I am no closer to an answer that satisfies me. If you're following this account and want to hear more from the archives, subscribe now. There are stories in these records that deserve witnesses. The next 4 days were ordinary, and in retrospect, that ordinariness was its own kind of message. The work continued. Trees fell. The horse team moved timber. Eriksson cooked. Martin complained about his knees. The sounds did not return, and the men who had heard them began the gradual work of talking themselves out of what they'd experienced. This is what men do. It is not stupidity. It is a survival mechanism of a different kind, the kind that allows a man to continue doing the work that feeds his family, when the alternative is to pack his gear and walk 8 miles through winter forest on a road that might or might not be passable. Then the deer appeared, or rather what had been a deer appeared. Halvorson found it on a Monday morning, 30 yards off the main cutting trail, and he came back to camp to get Lindqvist before he said anything to the other men, which tells you something about Halvorson's judgment. Lindqvist went with him, and I was asked to come as well. I don't know why, perhaps because I was available and young enough to be sent on errands without consultation. What we found in the snow among the birches was a roe deer, or had been one, and the manner of what had happened to it defied the vocabulary available to 3 men standing in cold air, trying to describe what they saw to each other. The animal had not been eaten. That was the first wrongness. Whatever had killed it had not killed it for food, or had not found the food worth taking. The second wrongness was the manner of death, which suggested force of a kind that no natural predator in that forest could have applied. Lindqvist said nothing for a long time. Then he said we would not mention this to the other men until he had thought about it. We didn't, but Per had followed us at a distance, and he saw enough to write about it that evening, choosing his words carefully, the way a man writes when he knows that what he's describing will look like madness on paper. He wrote, "The deer appeared to have been pressed. Not mauled, pressed, as by something enormous that had placed its weight upon it deliberately. The tracks around it were the same tracks as those found near the horse pen, bipedal, long striding, sinking deep. And they approached the deer from the north, circled it twice in a pattern that was almost ceremonial in its precision, and then led back north into the timber. There was no sign of struggle. Whatever happened to that deer, it had happened quickly." That night, Lindqvist reorganized the sleeping arrangements, putting the smallest men in the center bunks and the largest near the walls, a modification that no one questioned and that everyone understood. He also moved the draft horses from the pen on the north side of the camp to a makeshift enclosure between the 2 rear bunkhouses, and he said this was because the weather was turning and they needed to be closer to the feed. The horses knew something had changed in the territory. They were restless in ways that draft horses, heavy and patient by nature, are not supposed to be restless. Old Martin watched them and said nothing, but he took to sleeping in the enclosure with them, wrapped in blankets, his back against the log wall. The nights grew longer. In Dalarna in November, darkness owns most of the day. Carl began his own practice around this time, which was to take his supper outside when the weather permitted, sitting on the step of the bunkhouse and eating in the direction of the tree line. I asked him once what he was doing, and he said he was watching. I asked what for. He said, "You watch long enough at a thing, the thing starts to watch back, and then at least you know what you're dealing with." I did not have an answer for that then. I do not entirely disagree with it now. On the 14th night, Carl came inside at full dark and found Lindqvist and said quietly that he had seen something at the tree line. Lindqvist called me and Bjorn, and the 4 of us went out with 2 lanterns and stood at the edge of the clearing, in the cold that by then had acquired a different quality, something beyond mere temperature, something that seemed to carry intentionality. Carl pointed to a gap between 2 pine trunks at the edge of the tree line, perhaps 40 yards from where we stood. I looked. For a long moment I saw only darkness. Then I saw what Carl had been trying to show us, which was that the darkness in that particular gap was different from the other darkness, being too still and too shaped for the shifting randomness of shadow. Whatever was standing in those trees was standing absolutely motionless. It was tall enough that I could not see its top in the dark. None of us spoke. The lanterns stayed lit. The dark shape in the trees did not move. This continued for perhaps 3 minutes, and then Lindqvist made a sound, not a word, just a sound from the back of his throat, and turned and walked back to the bunkhouse, and the rest of us followed without being told to. We understood. The following morning, the conversation that had been deferred for 2 weeks finally occurred. Lindqvist said what everyone already knew, which was that the camp had something in the timber that he could not account for. and that it had been watching them for at least 2 weeks, and that it was large. He said they had a contract to fulfill, and that walking off a contract in winter with 11 families behind them was not a decision to make on the basis of animal tracks and a shape in the dark. Bjorn said it was a troll. He said it without embarrassment, using the word the way a man uses a word that fits the shape of a thing, even when he knows that educated people will object to it. His grandmother had told him stories. His grandmother had been a practical woman who had lived 70 years in the forests of Dalarna and had not been given to invention. He was not saying it was a supernatural creature. He was saying it was a word that the forest had provided for things that were very large and very old and did not want company. Sigurd read a passage from his Bible. Per wrote in his journal. Carl looked at the wall. Lindqvist said they would set a watch. One man on the bunkhouse roof with a rifle and a lamp from 1 hour after dark until dawn, rotating in 4-hour shifts. He said if the shape came close enough to threaten the camp or the horses, it should be discouraged. He used that word. Discouraged. It was the most diplomatic word I have ever heard a practical man use for shooting at something unknown in the dark. I drew the first watch of the second shift, which put me on the roof from 2 in the morning until dawn. There is a particular quality to darkness in a Nordic forest at that hour in November that I have encountered nowhere else. It is not simply the absence of light. It is the presence of something that light merely interrupts when it arrives, a fundamental condition that the brief Nordic days only partially suspend. I sat on the roof with the rifle across my knees and a lantern at my side, and I watched the tree line in all directions as Lindqvist had instructed, and for the first 2 hours, I saw nothing. Then the sound returned. It was the same sound I had heard the first night, that low structured resonance, but closer now, much closer. It was coming from the west side of the clearing, and as I turned toward it, I understood that it had been going on for some time before I registered it, as if it had started at a frequency below my ability to notice and had gradually risen into my range of perception. It lasted perhaps a minute. Then, from the east tree line, the answer came. The same 7-second interval, the same call and response pattern that Per had documented from the bunkhouse weeks before. There were 2 of them. There had always been 2 of them. I did not fire the rifle. I know that in the retelling this sounds like a failure of nerve, and perhaps it was. But the truth is that I could not see anything at which to aim, and firing blindly into a forest in the dark at something I could not see and could not identify seemed in the moment like an action that would accomplish nothing except to announce precisely where I was. I held the rifle. I watched. The sounds continued for perhaps 10 minutes, moving slowly, north and south, always keeping the camp centered between them. Then they stopped, and the silence that followed was so complete that the absence of sound felt like pressure against my ears. What I remember most about the rest of that watch was the cold. I had believed I was dressed for it, having spent weeks in that forest already, but there is a cold that arrives with fear that ordinary clothing does not address. It was in my chest and in my hands, and by the time Bjorn came to relieve me at dawn, I had lost feeling in my left foot from the knee down. I told Lindqvist what I had heard. He listened without expression and said he would double the watch. The next 3 nights followed the same pattern. The sounds, the call and response, the slow perambulation around the camp's perimeter. No one was sleeping well. Eriksson burned the porridge 2 mornings in a row because he had fallen asleep stirring it. The horses were producing less work and eating more, burning energy on anxiety that should have been spent on pulling timber. Old Martin slept in the pen with them every night now, and he had taken to humming old songs to settle them, and the sound of his old voice carrying across the camp in the small hours was both comforting and somehow more desolate than silence. What you have to appreciate is that these were not fearful men, not by inclination or by temperament. They had worked timber in provinces where the winters killed careless men, where the falling trees would crush you if you misjudged the angle, where a foot caught in a log jam would hold you under until it didn't matter anymore. They measured risk every single day, and they had calibrated their tolerance for it over years of practical experience. What the sounds in the dark were doing to them was different from ordinary fear. It was eroding something, wearing away at the confidence that competent men build in themselves through years of surviving difficult things. Whatever was in the timber seemed to understand this. Have you heard accounts like this from forests in your region? Stories passed down through families, things workers refuse to name openly. Leave them in the comments. I'd like to know if others found these accounts in their own family histories. On the 18th night, it came into the camp. We know this from the tracks, and from what Per wrote that morning, and from what Halvorsen saw when he was on watch, and which he could not fully describe coherently for 3 days afterward. The tracks showed that it had entered the clearing from the north, moved at a measured pace between the two front bunkhouses, paused for some time near the cookhouse, and then moved to the horse enclosure where it had stood outside the log wall for what the depth of the impressions suggested was a considerable period. It had then left the camp through the south in the direction from which the answering calls had always come. Halvorsen said he had seen it from the roof. He said it crossed the open clearing in full moonlight, and he had not fired the rifle because his hands would not function. He described it as very tall. He said its proportions were wrong in a way that he could not put into specific language. He said it moved without sound despite its size, and that this was somehow more frightening than anything else about it. He said it stopped in the clearing and turned and looked up at him on the roof, and that its eyes caught the moonlight and returned it. He said the color of the reflection was wrong, yellow-green where a predator's eyes would be amber. He said he could not tell the shape of the face because the face was in shadow, but that the eyes were widely spaced, more widely than any animal he had catalogued in his experience, and higher from the ground than seemed possible. The horses were unharmed. This, I have always found to be the most difficult detail to account for, because whatever stood outside that log wall for as long as it stood there had not touched them, had not attempted the wall, had apparently merely stood, watching, as Carl might have said, learning the lay of things. Old Martin, asleep in the pen with his blankets and his old songs, had not woken. The horses had not panicked. Whatever communication passed between the thing outside the wall and the animals inside it, it had been conducted in a register that bypassed alarm. Lindqvist called his second meeting. He laid out what was known, the sounds, two distinct sources, call and response. The tracks, bipedal, enormous, entering the camp. The sighting. He said the tracks showed deliberate movement, not random wandering, and that the pattern of visits showed a consistent approach from the north with a consistent answering presence from the south. He said they had obligations under contract, and that he was not prepared to void those obligations without understanding the situation better. Sigurd said his grandmother had told him about a creature in the old stories, something very large and very old that lived in the deep forests, and that was not seen in ordinary seasons, only in years when the cutting went too deep. He said this with the same plainness with which Bjorn had used the word troll, practically as a man names a tool that fits the work. Lindqvist did not dismiss this. He had been foreman long enough to know that dismissing the frameworks through which men process fear produces less workable outcomes than engaging with them. He said they would reinforce the bunkhouse walls with whatever timber they had available, that the watch would be doubled to 2 men at all times, and that if anything approached within 20 yards of the camp perimeter at night, it would be fired upon. Carl said quietly that he did not think shooting at it would help. Lindqvist asked him why. Carl said that it had been in the camp. It had walked between their bunkhouses. It had stood at their horse pen. If it had wanted to do harm, it had had the opportunity and had not taken it. He said that everything it had done suggested observation rather than aggression, and that the worst thing they could do was introduce aggression into a situation that had not yet become aggressive. No one had a clean answer for this. The meeting ended without resolution, which is the most honest outcome a meeting under those circumstances can reach. The reinforced watch continued. The sounds continued. And on the 22nd day, the behavior changed. It had been a wolf taking the bait traps that Lindqvist had set along the north perimeter, ordinary activity from an ordinary animal, and Halvorsen had gone out at dawn to check them. He returned 40 minutes later at a run, which was something none of us had seen Halvorsen do before. He had not come back through the north entrance. He had come around the entire camp's perimeter to the south entrance, which added 20 minutes to his return, and which he could not fully explain, except to say that the north was wrong that morning, and he had not been willing to come back through it. What he had found in the northern perimeter was not the wolf. The wolf trap had been triggered and the wolf taken, but not in any manner consistent with a wolf being caught in a trap. The trap itself had been removed from its anchor, and the wolf, trap and all, had been carried away northward into the timber. The track pattern showed the same bipedal stride, the same deep impressions, but now with an irregularity in the right side, impressions that suggested the carrier was offset to one side by weight. It had picked up a wolf in a trap and carried it away. The distance between impressions had not noticeably shortened. What do you think they encountered? Is this something from the old stories your family carried, or does it suggest something no stories account for? Share your theories below. That afternoon, Lindqvist sent a man to the nearest settlement. Per volunteered and was sent, with a letter that Lindqvist had written to the company's regional representative. I have a rough memory of what the letter said, Per having described it in his journal before he departed. It said that the camp had encountered an unidentified animal presence in the surrounding forest that had made the working conditions inadvisable, and that the foreman was requesting either extraction of the crew or the arrival of additional armed personnel familiar with the local territory, and that this was not a request made from inexperience or unsteadiness, but from practical assessment of a situation that had gone beyond the camp's capacity to manage. Per left in mid-morning, and we expected him back the following afternoon. He returned the morning after that, 2 days later, and the answer he brought from the regional representative was that the contract deadline was in 3 weeks, and that additional personnel could not be organized in that time frame, and that if the crew abandoned the camp before contract completion, their wages for the entire season would be forfeited. This was a number that most of the men in that camp could not afford to lose. Sigurd read from his Bible every night now. Eriksson began drinking from a flask he had kept hidden since October, which, in a camp where drinking was prohibited, showed a threshold of stress that the rest of us tacitly acknowledged by saying nothing about it. Per filled pages of his journal in the evenings, writing small to conserve paper, covering both sides. He had developed a system for tracking the sounds and tracks by date, and when he showed me the accumulated record, I saw what the day-by-day experience had obscured. The radius of the tracks was decreasing. Each week the perimeter walk had moved closer to the camp. What we had taken for a stable pattern was not stable at all. It was a progression. Carl had been making his own measurements, pacing the perimeter each morning to find and map the previous night's tracks, and his numbers corroborated pairs. The stands in the tree line were getting closer. The nightly passage around the camp was tightening. He calculated, in the careful way that quiet men sometimes have, that at the current rate of closure, the perimeter of activity would bring whatever was in the timber within arm's reach of the bunkhouse walls, within approximately 10 days. Carl brought this calculation to Lindqvist privately, not at a meeting, because he understood that the meeting was a tool for managing the group, and that this information needed to reach the foreman without the additional weight of collective panic. Lindqvist looked at the numbers for a long time and then said he would need to think about it. Carl said he understood. Carl said that he had also noticed something else, which was that the calls from the south had stopped 3 days ago. Only the northern presence was announcing itself now. He said he didn't know whether this meant the southern one had left or that it had simply stopped announcing itself. Lindqvist said that he appreciated the distinction. The 26th night brought snow, and the snow brought its own silence that layered over the forest's existing quiet and created something absolute. Bjorn had the first watch, and he reported in the morning that nothing had been visible from the roof, that the snow had reduced visibility to perhaps 10 yards, and that the watch had therefore been functionally blind for most of the night. This we understood to mean that if something had moved in the camp during those hours, we would not have known it. The snow stopped before dawn, and the new day revealed tracks. Not at the perimeter. In the camp itself again, for the second time, but now in greater number, and covering more of the cleared ground. They had been everywhere. Between the bunkhouses, around the cookhouse, along the outer wall of the equipment shed. One set of tracks went directly to the bunkhouse door, to the main door of the building where 9 men had slept that night, and stopped there, and the depth of the impressions at the door indicated that whatever made them had stood at that threshold for a long time. We stood in the cleared space and looked at the record of the night, and no man spoke for a very long time. Then old Martin said, quietly, that the horses had been calm all night, that they had not made a sound, and that this was not the calm of animals that had not noticed something nearby, but the calm of animals that had been quieted. He knew the difference, he said. He had been around horses his whole life. Something had stood outside that pen wall for hours and had kept those horses quiet by an act of will or communication that he had no category for, and the horses had accepted this, and this was more frightening to him than any amount of sound or visible tracks because he could not account for the intelligence it suggested. Lindqvist said they would be leaving. Not immediately, not in a panic, because panic in winter forest kills men as surely as anything else. But they would pack what was essential, leave what was not, and be gone from the camp before the following nightfall. He said he would personally bear the responsibility for the broken contract and would settle accounts with the company in whatever manner was available to him, because a man's responsibilities to the men in his charge superseded his responsibilities to a company's timber delivery schedule. Per wrote in his journal, Lindqvist announced our departure at 7:18 in the morning. The announcement was greeted with relief that no man was willing to express openly, but that was visible in every face. We have been here 26 days. Subscribe for more true historical accounts from the archives. The stories these men carried deserve more than silence. The packing took the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. Men who have worked timber camps know how to move with controlled efficiency when moving is necessary, setting aside anything not immediately essential, loading what is onto the horse sledge, wrapping what needs protection from the cold in canvas and rope. We ate a solid meal at midday because Eriksson was an experienced camp cook and knew that men walking 8 miles through winter forest needed fuel regardless of circumstances, and then we were ready. Carl was the last to leave the bunkhouse. I saw him stop in the doorway and stand for a moment, looking back into the empty interior, the bunks stripped, the lamp removed, the floor showing the cold prints of 11 men's boots going toward the door and none going back. Then he pulled the door closed, not latching it because there was no point, and walked to where the rest of us were assembled in the clearing. He did not look back at the tree line. He looked forward. Lindqvist counted heads. 11. We began walking south. The road out was the logging road, 8 miles of compacted snow and frozen mud that widened gradually as it descended from the timber camp toward the river crossing and the small settlement beyond. Old Martin drove the horse team, and the rest of us walked. The sound of boots on frozen ground and the creak of the sledge and the steady plodding of the horses created a rhythm that was almost comforting after weeks of listening for things that made no mechanical sound at all. We had been walking for perhaps an hour when Per, who was near the front of the group, stopped and raised his hand. From the forest to the east came a sound. The same resonance, the same low-structured call. Not aggressive, not rushing, simply announcing, as it always announced, that it was present, that it knew where we were, that it had known, probably, from the moment we began packing, that we were leaving. No one ran. I want to make that clear, because in the telling of such things there is an expectation of panic, of men scattered by fear, and that is not what happened. What happened was that 11 experienced men stood in a frozen forest road and listened to a sound they did not understand, coming from a forest they could no longer afford to remain in, and then they began walking again, at the same pace, because they understood without speaking that running was not the appropriate response, and that the road was long and the light was short, and that surviving the next 8 miles required every scrap of the competence that had kept them alive in these forests for most of their working lives. The sound did not follow us, or if it did, it made no announcement of doing so. We walked the 8 miles in silence that was broken only by the sounds of our own passage, and we reached the river crossing before dark, and the settlement beyond it as the first stars were appearing in a sky that had cleared at some point during the afternoon, and the light in the windows of the settlement's 3 buildings was the most beautiful light I have ever seen in my life. We did not go back. The company sent agents to investigate the abandoned camp the following spring. Per told me later, in a letter, that he had heard from one of them that the camp had been disturbed, the bunkhouses entered, items moved, but not destroyed, as if something had explored it, curious about the objects of 11 men's daily lives now that the men themselves were gone. Per said the agents attributed the disturbance to wildlife. Lindqvist settled with the company for the cost of the abandoned contract. I never learned the precise terms, and he did not speak of it to us. He moved his family to a different province the following year, and worked coastal fisheries until he retired. I do not know if he was ever troubled in his sleep by the memory of those weeks. He was not a man who would have allowed you to see it if he was. Per became a schoolteacher and kept his journal in a locked box that his daughter found after his death. And through her I received the copies of his entries that I have referenced throughout this account. Carl left that winter, and I never saw him again. I heard secondhand, many years later, that he had gone north, which is a thing that makes sense to me only in the way that certain things make sense about certain people, which is to say, obliquely, and with the understanding that some men are drawn toward what frightens them rather than away from it. I hope he found what he was looking for. I hope whatever was in those forests recognized him for what he was. I hope the meeting, if it happened, went better than anyone had reason to expect. Bjorn still used the word troll. He used it for the rest of his life, and he was not embarrassed by it, and no one who had been there argued with him. There are stories in those forests older than the timber companies that arrived to cut them, older than the settlements that preceded the companies, older than the language in which Bjorn spoke the word. The people who had lived in those forests before anyone kept records had names for what lived in the deep timber, in the places where the old trees were oldest and the light in summer barely reached the ground. They did not cut there. They had reasons. Old Martin said it best on the first night after we arrived in that settlement, when we were warm and fed and the fire was doing its work on men who had been cold for weeks. He said that the forest is older than we are. He said the trees were there before the first man came through with an axe, and they will still be standing after the last one. He said that we had been guests, whether we understood ourselves to be or not, and that we had outstayed our welcome, and that the polite thing to do, which we had done, was to leave. He did not think we had been hunted. He thought we had been asked to leave by something that was accustomed to asking and being understood, and that our failure to understand it earlier was a failing of our kind, rather than a malice of its kind. I am 71 years old, and I have worked forests and coasts and merchant vessels, and none of it has given me a framework for what I know I saw and heard in those weeks. I have no definitive answer, and I am no longer looking for one. I know what the tracks showed. I know what Halverson saw from the roof. I know the calculation Carl made about the decreasing radius, and I know that we were right to leave when we did. I know that the forest above that river crossing was not cut that winter, and that when the company sent other men the following autumn, those men also came back early, and the year after that, no company sent anyone, and the road into that timber fell apart over the winters and now would not be passable by any equipment I know of. The forest took it back. The forest always takes it back. Subscribe for more accounts from the archives. These stories were never meant to be forgotten. The men who survived them deserve to be believed, and the least we can do now is listen.